So the big overarching ancient philosophical question that we're starting with and that's motivating the project is this question of how virtue and well-being are related. So here's what we're doing to investigate this large question. We're looking at incoming college students. We'll have self and peer report information about traits, virtues, well-being, and characteristic adaptations. We'll also use the method of personal projects analysis, and that I'm going to say quite a bit more about. We will look at this sample over time in 4 different waves. We predict an increase in evidence for virtue over time based on some other people's research that shows that virtues do increase, or virtue-related traits increase in college students. And we expect that an intervention will increase virtue even more. So the information that we need to complete the project and answer the big question, we need to know a lot about students, the student participants. We need to know about their goals, how they conceive of them, how they represent them to themselves, how those goals are related, whether those goals involve virtues from their point of view, and how successful they are in terms of pursuit of those goals. So we think that personal projects analysis is the right method for answering these questions. It's a method that has a lot of virtues for our purposes. The main one being that there's a lot of open-ended narrative that's part of the method. The project has 4 stages. So the first stage is project elicitation. Participants are given a description of what a personal project is. The next stage is project appraisal, where people are asked to score all the projects that they listed before on various dimensions. In the third stage, cross-impact analysis, people are given this representation of their projects down and across and asked to rank or score how much their projects either facilitate each other or impede each other, or whether they're neutral with respect to each other. And in the final stage, the hierarchical analysis, people are asked in an interview setting or to write down the whys about why they have the projects that they have until they get to some kind of relatively terminal value. The hypothesis is that, the prediction is that we'll find that virtue develops naturally in people in ways that are shaped by their goals and strategies. But we're also interested in whether we can encourage the development of virtue. The idea is that participants are first given a kind of free narrative space to envision their ideal future, and then they're given more guiding questions to move them along in that kind of narrative exercise. And some of our guiding questions would have to do with character and what kind of person they see themselves as becoming, not just what sorts of goals they see themselves as achieving in their ideal futures.
So as a philosopher and a sociologist, we have each independently studied abuses committed by Christian churches against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, often abbreviated LGBT people, living in North America. Our collaborative project proposes to investigate 2 broad questions related to this research. First, what motivates non-LGBT church members to end these abusive practices, regardless of whether or not they believe homosexuality is sinful? And second, how do LGBT people who have been victims of what we call sacramental shame and other forms of spiritual violence overcome these harms in order to experience a loving God, to serve others, and to flourish? Spiritual violence is an umbrella term for a variety of practices that use religious means to degrade or demean a person in his or her relationship with God. So some examples of spiritual violence include interpretations of scripture that advance degrading views about LGBT people or same-sex relationships, clergy sexual abuse of children, in which the priest who represents God is simultaneously a source of sexual violation, and religious teachings or traditions that promote the spiritual inferiority of women to men in God's eyes. So shame can inspire us to atone or apologize, but when a person is shamed for something that they can't change, the shame compels a kind of obsessive inward turning and focus on perpetually trying to fix oneself.
So our research question regarding all of these groups is what helps to overcome spiritual violence? Respondents and authors of written testimonies have attested that claiming an LGBT identity allows them to feel like whole persons, to stop having to focus inward all the time, to be able to focus on serving others, and to experience God's presence in their lives. Regarding non-LGBT Christians, the question is, what creates the motivation to stop, to end spiritually violent practices, to listen to LGBT people, to let go of judgment, or in virtue ethics terms, to cultivate authentic Christian love? How do they come to this point?
Our project achieves deep integration by interweaving sociological methods of data collection and analysis with philosophical methods of analysis and moral argumentation. So in this project then, the deep integration will occur in processes of both data collection and analysis. Guided by both philosophical and sociological questions, we will gather data using sociological methods. Specifically, we will conduct participant observation at gatherings, conferences, and discussions among participants in these movements. We will conduct semi-structured interviews with participants, and we'll gather documents published by participants. We will use the qualitative data management package in vivo to identify themes, patterns, and trends in these data. An analysis will take place alongside data gathering, so that as new themes emerge, they can dynamically shape the questions we bring to the field and the themes we look for. The dynamic process will continue until no new themes are uncovered. Our analysis of the data will also take on a hybrid form. We will both generate theory from the ground up on the data we collect, based on the data we collect, and we will extend existing theoretical perspectives in feminist and queer theory, as well as in virtue ethics and violence studies, using the data. Our methodological innovation then is to examine situated accounts and personal narratives of people's motivation to Christian virtue.
So this study will have an academic significance, a methodological significance, and a practical significance for those with an investment in the parts of life where spirituality and sexuality overlap. Academically, it will help us to understand how people develop the motivation to eradicate harmfully shaming stigmas in religious institutions and religious life, and how they transcend these practices. It will also help us to understand the social and ethical processes in which people are working to bring about an end to the so-called culture wars, the notion that LGBT people are the enemies of religion and that religion is the enemy of LGBT people. Practically, the study will help Christians to understand both the harms and the gifts that Christianity brings to LGBT people. It will help us to identify what kinds of resources, languages, and framings can help movements for social justice to grow. And it will help the broader North American society to understand the changes happening in these large and influential religious communities by shedding light on how people have come to these movements, as well as the possibilities that these movements are creating.
Since 2001, more than 2.2 million Americans have deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. An estimated 330,000 will develop post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, veterans with PTSD often also report a rupture in their sense of self. One of my patients spoke about a me before deployment and a me after deployment, and the incoherence between the two. So PTSD is a disordering of one's narrative identity as well as shifts in character. If we think of PTSD merely as this cluster of symptoms, we miss that PTSD is a disordering of the person, in particular a disordering of moral character and narrative identity. But as we've just seen, concerns about character and identity are central motivations for why many individuals seek treatment.
Contemporary philosophers now widely recognize that we need to understand not only what virtue is, but how it can be strengthened. And we need to understand the growth of virtue in a way that's realistic and is informed by the best empirical science. Studying character in veterans with PTSD provides a chance to do just this, thereby enriching the empirical basis and reach of virtue ethics. Our study aims to address basically three big questions. First, how does trauma and its treatment impact the growth of Aristotelian moral virtues and the lessening of related vices? In particular, we're going to look at virtues that have to do with appropriate anger and fear. Our second big question, how does PTSD treatment impact the narrative self and vice versa? And then the third question is the relationship between these. How do character and identity impact one another in the context of trauma and its treatment?
Hypothesis 1. We believe disproportionate fear will decrease through treatment. We'll test this hypothesis using an eye tracker, which will measure automatic, non-conscious processing of fear-related stimuli. Hypothesis 2. Inappropriate fear in objectively safe situations will decrease through treatment. We'll measure this with a galvanic skin response, a proxy of the fight or flight system, while patients complete in vivo exposures in safe situations such as a crowded grocery store. Hypothesis 3, as fear levels decrease, inappropriate anger will also decrease. This will be measured in two ways. First, participants will take the eye-ear app home with them. This will assess for verbal expressions of anger in everyday situations like being with the kids. Second, a criminal record check before and after treatment will assess for crimes related to excessive anger, such as assault or domestic battery. Hypothesis 4, we believe behaviors related to ordinary expressions of courage and gentleness will increase through treatment. We'll measure this through peer report by a close other, such as a romantic partner. We'll also get the veteran's perspective on this through an interactive interview with a study researcher, shifting to narrative identity. Hypothesis 5, adaptive integration of the traumatic memory into the life story will increase through treatment, as will narratives of the capable moral self.
One advantage of our study is that our data is both deep and broad. It's deep in that it's idiographic and extensive. It's broad in that it includes diverse sources of information: the life story, ecological momentary assessment, psychophysiology, and non-conscious processes. So our interpretive conclusions won't have to draw on a single event or even on a single metric of change. Rather, we'll combine types of analysis: the body's fear response with the individual's life story, cognitive biases with peer reports of virtue, treatment progress with anger levels in the natural ecology. Deep integration is built into the kind of data we're gathering. We've also built it into the process of interpretation through interdisciplinary case conferences. The philosopher, the psychologist, and the study therapists will meet together to discuss particular cases and to reach consensus about the meaning of the data.
In our proposed project, we seek deep integration among our disciplines on the subject of the peaceful self. To belong is a basic human need, and this need arises from our evolved social nature. A peaceful self, then, in our working definition, is characterized by a disposition for benevolence and justice, and self-efficacious skills in non-violent conflict transformation and peacemaking. We will investigate the peaceful self as an aspect of the self associated with virtue embodied in social interaction. We will address key question 2, how will your project develop and use innovative methodologies by using ambulatory biosensors and electronic diaries to complement and integrate behavioral data with point event, physiological and language data indicative of mood, emotion, and motivational states associated with peaceful behavior.
And here we will build on two core ideas from hermeneutic philosopher and theologian Paul Ricoeur, especially to analyze the narrative development of identities. Two core ideas are, in the first place, his narrative conception of identity foregrounds connectedness and considers narratives as laboratories for moral judgment. And the second core idea we will build on concerns his distinction between two poles of identity representing two different forms of permanence in time and mediated by the narrative development of identities.
We will compare and contrast the development of peaceful selves in Japanese and American preschool children and adolescents. We will also study the exemplary peaceful selves of two Nobel Prize laureates from different cultural origins to understand how the narrative development of their identities fuels their motivation to act for others and what their virtuous actions mean to themselves and to others. In my own component of the project, I will conduct naturalistic observations of preschool children's peer interaction, both in Japan and the USA. Focus will be on peer conflict and its aftermath, and then we will also do point-event biosensor detection of salivary alpha amylase levels following the occurrence and non-occurrence of post-conflict peacemaking and consolation. You see a digital tension indicator to assess skin conductance levels, a wrist-worn electronic diary, as well as context and time-triggered in situ questionnaires on a smartphone in a similar way.
In the second component of our project, I will develop a biologically informed reinterpretation and extension of Ricoeur's analysis of virtues, motives, and the self. This brings us to the theme of deep integration, which we will pursue as follows. By extending the conceptual and methodological connections between the three project components, we will develop a humanistic naturalism as an integrative framework for our research, and this humanistic naturalism is meant as an alternative both for reductionist and deterministic forms of naturalism and for biologically uninformed forms of philosophy.
We want to provide immersively interdisciplinary answers to a set of important questions that, about the self and its moral development in a non-weird population, China. Our first research question, it has to do with activations in the brain and moral priming conditions in Eastern and Western participants, including perhaps Asian Americans. Our second research question has to do with moral development and differences East and West. In particular, looking at different means by which East Asians and Westerners integrate the self and morality in childhood. Our next pair of questions are primarily descriptive from a humanities context. And here, first, we're looking at the representation of the Confucian self in a very large database of Chinese texts across many, many centuries. And lastly, we're trying to put it all together in RQ4. We're trying to synthesize extant research about the self to explain the uniqueness of the Confucian self.
Thank you, Ryan. Now, Sherry Han is responsible for the first research question. Sherry has proposed a set of hypotheses to investigate how differences between the actual self and ideal self predicts variation in life satisfaction. He wants to look into how collective and individual selves can kind of modulate that, and finally how different understandings of the self can modulate whether or not you appreciate individual or collective self.
Our other participant, Julie Qi, is a professor of psychology, developmentalist at Chinese Academy of Sciences. And she's pursuing our research question involving differences across East and West in the relationship between morality and the self. According to this familiar model from Bergman, the self and morality don't integrate until adolescence. But this raises some questions that have yet to be answered, especially with non-weird data about the role in childhood of the integration of self and morality. The paradigm that she wants to use to study this is the happy victimizer paradigm, using emotion attributions as a means of getting at this form of integration between self and morality.
I'm responsible for the third research question, and we want to model the evolution of the Chinese self over history using text analysis. We also want to do word-level analysis, so kind of close reading, and for that we use dependency modeling or association mining, where we can study how particular words, virtue terms, moral exemplars predict occurrences of, for instance, the self.
So we're trying to tell the story of the Confucian self through these three areas, but our project not only does studies in these areas, but we bring to bear the expertise of our project team in those and more areas to truly surround this problem.